Hello. In case you missed part one, this is the second half of my conversation with my friend Michelle Stassen. Michelle is a registered social worker with a private counseling practice here in Victoria, BC. I always have the best conversations with her. And so without further ado, here is part two of my conversation with Michelle Stassen. Tell me about coming out.
Coming out. Well, this is an interesting, I was gonna say this is an interesting story, but then I'm like, my life is so interesting. It's not that interesting. It's like, it's fine. But it's not simple. Mainly because of the fact that I was raised in a quite religious home. And my siblings and I growing up were never that involved in, I think, the religion from a personal perspective. It was more my parents, but we went to church every Sunday. I also went to church on Wednesday nights all through my elementary school for like a girls' club thing. But I specifically, out of my two siblings, I went to a Christian camp every summer as well, from probably age 9 until I graduated high school. First, I was attending the camp. Then I would go and be a counselor. And for a while, I also went and my dad's cousin and his wife worked at the camp in a leadership position. So I would go and cook for a week or babysit their kids while at camp. And that was an environment that was very, very religious based. One of those Christian camps where people take things seriously. We would do like a sermon every morning, sing Christian songs multiple times a day, do devotions and prayer every night, have small groups. It was all very involved. And because of that, my relationship with Christianity became like very personal and real for me. So I was very much a practicing Christian for throughout my childhood and into my early adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, I went to a high school that was it was very open. I was in an arts program. I went to an arts elementary school, and then into high school, I went into a drama program. So I was very much involved in the arts and theater and acting, and had a kind of tight-knit group of friends that were all very open-minded, and wasn't a Christian school. So I was developing this sort of religious, conservative side of me on one side. And then on the other side, I was just trying to live a normal high schooler life. And I remember for a good chunk of my high school feeling very split between these two sides of me. And at school, I was swearing and drinking sometimes and smoked weed a few times and said whatever I wanted and just didn't care, didn't give a shit. And then when I was at home or with my family or with friends from camp, I wouldn't swear at all. I would never say something like, "Oh my God." I was very conservative. I would go to Bible studies, and I could flip the switch on that so easily. So I could be in one group of people and be really good at filtering what I would say, and then be in another group and take the filter off. And I felt really a lot of shame and fear around that, particularly because Christianity, while it has a lot of wonderful parts to it, is a religion based on shame and fear.
Yeah.
In my perspective. And I'm not in any way trying to bash a religion or say that it's not, people shouldn't believe it. And there's many beautiful parts to it. But there's a big element of shame and a big element of fear. So me trying to battle with the fact that I always felt like more authentic and more myself and happier amongst, like my school friends, would then trigger a lot of shame and fear about what that meant for me, and basically that I was going to rot in hell, which is nice. So around that time in high school, I also started having this realization that I was attracted to women. I don't remember exactly how it came about. I just remember late at night doing research online at home while my parents were sleeping, reading about like, am I gay? What? Like, am I a lesbian? What does this mean? And, watching YouTube clips of girls kissing and being like, I'm into that. What does this mean? And I decided to come out to some friends at school. And I did. And then it kind of spread to basically everybody at school. And at that time, I was still so split that I remember thinking, I will not come out ever to my family or to, my Christian camp friends. Like this, that's never going to happen. It's not acceptable. It's not an option. And I was like kind of okay with that. I was doing my thing at school. I was having fun. I started dating somebody and I was really happy. And then we probably progressed to some minimal fooling around, like maybe a little bit of under the clothes stuff, not much. And then I went off to camp in that summer of, I think, grade 10, grade 11. And I felt so guilty about all the stuff with that girl and with school and everything. And I was like, it's not going to work. I just have to be straight. So I'm just going to, I can appreciate that guys are good looking. So I'm sure that this is doesn't have to be like an either or. I'm just going to kind of like pivot and then I'm just going to be straight and we're going to cool. So I came back to school the following year. I had broken up with that girl over the summer and then came back to school the following year and just like continued forward. And apparently all my friends were murmuring, being like, Michelle went to camp and came back straight. And they were all like, okay, cool. I guess we'll just let her do what she's doing. And that progressed forward until the second year of my undergrad. And at that point, I had been quite involved in this Christian group on campus. And I was, I'd gone on a mission trip to Guatemala, and I was really just had dedicated myself to the faith. But this girl had popped into one of my classes, and she was the first out lesbian that I had ever met. And I was just fascinated by her. I wasn't into her romantically. She was a very good friend of mine for many years and still is somebody important to me. But I wanted her to know everything about me. I wanted to just like kind of casually sidle up to her and be like, I think I like girls. But I was like, no, but that's not right because I'm trying not to do that. But it was a mind fuck and it threw me off for a while. And I think it took from the second semester of my first year to partway through my second year of my undergrad for me to kind of do a bunch of soul searching with myself and basically realize you are gay and you can't pretend that you're not. It's not working. And also to simultaneously realize that this overfocus on Christianity in my life was causing me to have a really horrible relationship with myself.
Did you ever consider reprogramming?
No.
Okay. So it was just more the guilt and shame from your upbringing and from your exposure to church and camp. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So I, around that time, started actually sort of embracing that myself. And I'd formed a friendship with that girl at that point, and she was really helpful in kind of introducing me to some different books and resources. And at that point, I finally got to a point where I was actually like, okay, I'm embracing this. This is okay. And I was starting to think about coming out to my parents. And long story short, since I've already made this story longer than it needed to be, I was outed accidentally to my mom by a friend from high school's mom that my mom was chatting with at a scrapbooking party. And this woman was like, oh, it was so nice that everyone at Unionville High School got to be so open and experiment. Everybody did, even Michelle. And my mom was like, sorry, what now? So my mom called me and was like, guess what I heard at a scrapbooking retreat? And when she asked me about it, I was like, well, I guess I'll just tell her the whole deal. But it was fine. Like my mom was like, does this mean you're not going to wear dresses anymore? And I was like, no, I like dresses. And she was like, okay. And that was kind of that. And when I came out to my dad, he was, I think, worried about me he had also kind of left the Christian faith at that point. And for him, I think he was worried that because he knows that I had so many ties to Christianity and friends that were conservative Christians, he was worried that it would be very hard for me to deal with those relationships, but he was fine from that perspective. So the process of getting there, like the actual coming out, was not a huge deal. And because of that, I remember years later in therapy, my therapist kind of trying to make a thing out of it. Like I remember her kind of being like, tell me more about coming out. Like that must have been a really big deal. And at the time I was like, not really. Like it's all good. I don't hold any shame at this point about my sexuality. I'm pretty proud and happy. I've had some great relationships. I feel no problems. Like it's all good. And she was kind of like, okay. And we moved on. And for a good chunk of time, I thought it was a non-issue. And it's only in more recent years, maybe the last 4 or 5 years, that kind of going back and reflecting, the coming out part wasn't a huge deal. But me grappling with those two sides and feeling a lot of shame and guilt and fear about being myself and worrying about what it would mean to let go of some of the rules or the structure around Christianity, and then being pushed into that because of the queerness side of things. I think all of that was actually what had a bigger impact on my mental health than anything else. And I'm actually still trying to navigate what impact that had. I know I will sometimes struggle with feeling like I don't fit in or I don't belong. I know I will struggle sometimes with feeling like I'm not good enough. And those insecurities coming out. And I suspect some of that is a result of that time of getting so good at separating myself into two pieces and being so good at disconnecting or playing like play acting in relationships that were really important to me. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a bigger deal than I've given it credit for.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a narrative happening with you that says that because there was so much tug of war, like back and forth conflict between these two sides of yourself in like high school and in the early years, that in choosing, when you finally decided to choose to come out and be your authentic self, that there's this part of you that says that in terms of the other side that you somehow failed, or that it's like you've been rejected by that side?
I don't know if I would say reject. It's interesting. I don't really feel that now in terms of in coming out and embracing that side of me, that I have been rejected by that side, because to me, that was actually more so me rejecting that side.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what that makes me think of is how much time and effort I spent trying to live up to something that I never felt I could. Trying to live up to how often I should be praying, how authentic my faith should feel, how easily I should be following along with these rules that I'm supposed to be following along with. All of these things where I constantly felt like I was falling short. I would go to camp, kind of get like a reality check, a Christian reality check, and think, okay, I'm going to be good now. I'm going to go home and I'm going to keep all the stuff up that I was doing here, and I'm going to be good, and I'm going to follow what I'm supposed to be doing, and it's going to be okay. And within weeks, I would start to kind of spill over into this other way of being. And then I would feel like I was failing. And I was not do it.
Right. So if I'm understanding you correctly, then that the failing in terms of being a good Christian was a much bigger narrative than just simply your sexuality.
Much bigger.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It was around my connection to myself, around the language I used, the people I spent time with, how I spent my time. It was all these things, and my sexuality was one part of that. And perhaps one part that pushed me to explore this and explore my relationship to Christianity more than I would have if I didn't have some sort of big thing to go, oh, like this doesn't fit. So you got to figure out, like, can you make it fit? And since there were already so many other parts that didn't fit, it just kind of, I think, pushed things along.
Yeah.
But me, in my second year of my undergrad, deciding that I was going to sort of accept and roll with that, with the sexuality side of things. At first, I was planning to stay with the Christianity. I spent a lot of time on gaychristian.net, on some forums, reading articles and talking to people about what it meant to be gay and Christian. And I was like, okay, I can work with this. So I think that gave me a little space to just say, like, I'm going to accept that I'm queer. And I think in doing that, it also gave me some space and opportunity to slowly start to push away from all the other stuff that also were part of what was making me feel so much shame and guilt.
Yeah.
So as opposed to me feeling like I was rejected by the Christian faith, I think me stepping away was actually saying, I'm not going to let you make me feel like I'm not good enough anymore.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that was a very important move, and I think a very good and helpful and healthy move, but it doesn't get rid of the internal narrative that still gets activated, like a trauma response when my insecurities get activated, that story that I'm not good enough or I can't live up to the expectations that people have for me or that the world has for me. I think that some of that bleeds over from that time.
It's funny because you talk about being in choir, and I didn't grow up. My family put me in a choir, men and boys church choir, an Anglican men and boys church choir, but we weren't super active as Anglicans per se. Like we did at home, there was no God talk or anything like that. And, but I do, like my experience in the church is very much rooted in this sense that the teachings that I was exposed to set such a high bar, an impossibly high bar. This idea of and yet at the same time extolled how I am not. There is only one God, and you are not it.
Yeah,
and yet the bar is practically godlike. So it's like we're set up to fail, and there's just very little embracing of humanity and a lot of the sin narrative and all of this just very destructive
Yeah.
mindset.
Yeah. And having worked in mental health, and continuing to do so. I said that like past tense, but I do work in mental health. More and more I have learned how pervasive shame is in mental illness and mental health struggles. I think it's sitting down as one of the many roots of every issue.
Yeah.
And that's where I think religion, and particularly Christianity, and again, I mean, this may be a controversial, I don't know if you were wanting to get this controversial with your conversations, but I can't talk about my experience with my sexuality without talking about what made it so hard. And really what made the upbringing that I had around Christianity so painful to me was that sort of the inherent shame-based setup of Christianity, which, like you said, is the idea that you are born already not good enough. Mm-hmm. Just by being a human being, you are not good enough to be with God. God loves you unconditionally, but you're not good enough to be with God unless somebody died for your sins. And that's what, Jesus and that whole kind of pathway. And given that my whole sort of mental health journey has been learning to believe that I'm good enough to be loved, I'm good enough to have people want me in their life, I'm good enough to take care of myself, all these things, I'm like, yeah, no wonder I struggle with believing that, when the message I was given from, childhood is you're not good enough to be with the, being that supposedly created you and loves you.
Yeah.
So I think that's been quite damaging to me. And I know it was quite damaging to my dad as well, which is one of the reasons why he's no longer a Christian also. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, the other side of it is also a lot of fear, right? So it's not only are you not good enough, but if you don't do things a certain way and believe a certain thing, you're going to eternally
burn. Yeah.
So whatever version you want to make of that. And that was repeated to me throughout my childhood. So yeah, no wonder I struggle with shame. No wonder I struggle with anxiety. And those both come up on a regular basis. The story you're not good enough comes up, and this fear, this kind of underlying fear that I'm not going to be okay in like a big, deep sense. I'm not going to be okay. Mm-hmm. And I have to work pretty hard to balance those thoughts out with different thoughts and connect to my spirituality in ways that give me different messages and connect to different faith. And sometimes it's easier to do that than others. Sometimes it's really, really hard. And that's likely when I do more of the numbing out, when I do more of TV watching and the food and playing solitaire for 7 hours, because then I'm not thinking about some of those big, awful feelings.
Well, if we consider how anxiety is rooted in always in the future, fear is always rooted in future. And my depression is always rooted in past, like regret, coulda, shoulda, woulda, all of that stuff. My sponsor used to say 1 foot in the future, 1 foot in the past, pissing on the present. And so I struggle with being mindfulness in the now when I'm either in that depressive state or that anxious state, and in just getting back to the what you're talking about in terms of being a sinner. You can't deliver a more anxious feeling than there's a world of hurt coming down the pike for you because you a sinner. And so it's like, how can that not create anxiety? Right. And I think, and so that makes a lot of sense. And I know that, it really strikes me how the actual Christ figure taught that heaven is within you, and that the way that you are is okay, and to love thyself and all of this stuff. And yet it seems that Christians are the ones that act the least Christ-like in terms of,
yes. And I would say, also to honor people in my life that I still really care about, that in the process of, in the church I went to, at the camp I went to, friends I had since childhood, they are some of the most authentic, wonderful, loving, and caring people. And I think that, if we were going to think of who's Christ-like, in many ways, I would say they are. So I do think that, like, to honor the many wonderful people out there who their faith is an important part of who they are, but it's also very authentic and it's very relational, and they're really wonderful people who care and love. That's all true. And we know that a lot of damage has been done in the name of Christianity, right?
Right.
On a global and international scale, the Christians have done some bad shit. Yeah. And that's been, in the name of Christ,
the Lord.
Which is a problem, because there's no way that like he said, that figure who
it's not what he taught,
historically existed, would never have done those things or spoken the way that people do. So one of the big things that for me, if I'm, for example, working with somebody who is, like, as a client, if I'm working with somebody who's Christian, I don't get into conversations about religion in terms of trying to shift people's perspective and help them believe something differently. Like, not my place. And also, I think religion can be a really huge protective factor for a lot of people. I think it can be a really awesome way to help cope and live in this world. So I'm all for it. But one thing that I do often coach people around from a therapeutic perspective is, can you shift your faith from being about rules and dogma to being about an authentic relationship with a higher power? And that may mean that you have more motivation and strength to kind of follow the rules that are important to you, which are values and morals, maybe, right? Which is important for all of us, to follow our own values and morals rather than calling them rules. But rather than having it motivated from fear and shame, can it be motivated from a place of love? Can you develop a more authentic relationship with a higher power? And that can work for anybody, whether it's Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, whatever organized sort of religion, or if it's somebody who's more spiritual, even somebody who's not really spiritual at all. It's that question of, like, relationship. And that's where I'm trying to shift my mindset around what it's like to still connect with some sort of faith and come to a place where I feel safe in this world, which has been really hard in the past year, right? And I do think it's not realistic to have a podcast where we don't at least talk a little bit about COVID, right? So it comes into mind for me in this conversation because anybody who feels or struggles with some sort of existential dread or fear about what's next, a fear of dying, questions or uncertainty around death or the afterlife, anybody who has that, which is a lot of people, whether we all think about it a lot or acknowledge it, many of us are carrying that. The type of trauma that's come up around not totally feeling safe and having a lot of people die and knowing that there's kind of something around that could be life-threatening to many people and could change and get worse. I think that has made a lot of people not feel safe because
very
we
much
don't know what's next.
Right.
And not just what's next for humanity, but like what's next for me if this doesn't go well. So I think it's important to honor that we're just walking around like trying to keep operating like normal, doing our jobs and keeping our apartments clean and taking care of our kids and doing all these things, trying to have this high performance, forgetting that a lot of us are walking around with this heightened sense of like terror about what's next, what's coming. Am I going to be okay? I don't know. And that's really scary. And we have to give ourselves like a little bit of a break. That's what we're dealing with.
Yes. Yeah. I think, I mean, even just if you consider how a seemingly normal operation food shopping has gotten so intensely weird.
Ugh, so weird.
Like as if that wasn't stressful enough, having to navigate those aisles and remember everything that I got to buy. Now I have to follow the arrows, not go near anybody, have my mask on. And it's like everybody is just, there's this atmosphere of, there's so much trepidation. And I always come back to my own, like, the thing that brings me comfort is my own relationship with spirituality, in the sense that I'm not God, but I am of the divine. Like, I have divinely given will, and that my higher power loves me and wants me to be happy and abundant, and it's me that gets in the way of that. And how can I change the narrative with myself and examine those belief systems that are keeping me small? And when I look at what you're talking about in terms of COVID and the fact that there's this global anxiety around this pandemic, I mean, it's like a movie.
Yeah.
And then we get the Delta variant. Everybody's like, what the frick are you talking about, Delta variant? I got vaccinated. Are you kidding me? This is not over. And it just doesn't seem to have any end in sight. And that is anxiety inducing.
Yes.
Yeah. Right. And so it comes back to, I come back to this idea of like, I don't understand what's happening. Things are different, very different than what I know life to be. And that there is something bigger at play here on an evolutionary scale, in terms of us evolving as humans, and in terms of our relationship with ourselves, on all these levels, like the stuff we've been talking about, including spiritually. And so how is this pandemic and the shift that we're going to see and these outcomes going to affect how, like, our relationship with ourselves and with others and with those concepts?
Yeah.
Like, how are they going to deepen? And that's why I think it's important that we continue doing this stuff. Why I started this podcast, because you're totally right. I can't have a podcast without talking about the pandemic. And if we're talking about fear and the relationship with the self and the narrative that we have with ourselves, that shit is going to influence those narratives. Because now, on top of isolating and depression and anxiety, all the just bog standard shit that I've been given since high school, I now have to navigate the fucking aisles and go in the right direction with the arrows. Otherwise, and I actually went into a store a couple of months ago. I forgot to put my mask on, and somebody from the store had to walk up to me and, "Excuse me, sir, you need to mask up." And I felt like such an asshole. I'm like, oh my God, I didn't even realize.
So judged.
So judged. Here's another, and then the narrative came up. You're a fuck up.
The worst thing is, like,
you don't give a shit about people. You're self-centered.
Clearly, no. And the worst thing is that if I was in that grocery store and I looked over at you and you weren't wearing a mask, I would have been like,
judged the shit out of me.
Yeah. What a dick.
I don't know him. I don't know him.
No, and I don't want to be that person. And
yeah.
That's the thing is something's coming out in all of us in different ways. And I know we're all sick of talking about COVID, and we're sick of dealing with it. And it is, right? It just is. And while I think it's helpful to have the idea of, let's not talk about it and obsess over it, let's just kind of like move forward and live our lives, that's great. But I also think it's important that we don't forget to pay attention to how much of an impact it has on each individual and on groups of people. And anytime I'm talking to a friend or a client, and also, trying to also do this with myself, but when somebody's like, things are hard, I'm not doing well, my mental health is plummeting, and then we're kind of going over, okay, what are all the things that are contributing to why you're struggling right now? I always make sure that I'm like, also, there's been a global pandemic for over a year. Mm-hmm. Like, let's not just kind of have gotten so used to it now that we're forgetting it has an impact. And that doesn't, acknowledging that it has an impact doesn't mean we don't move forward and we don't, figure out how to work with it. But pretending it doesn't have an impact and that everything's okay is causing us to be harder on ourselves than we need to be.
Yes.
causing our expectations of ourselves to be too high.
Right.
And I appreciate what you said there around recognizing that something like this is going to change things. It's going to change our relationships with ourselves, with other people, with the world, with our faith or spirituality, all these things. And, maybe the question is, can we put intention into focusing what direction that change takes?
Yeah.
Can I make that a change like you said, that gets deeper and more meaningful, rather than, a change where for me, where I could go is more into terror and more into fear and shame. And that's probably what will happen if I don't put a lot of intention into sort of redirecting myself towards, what do I need to add to be caring for myself and nurturing more faith and more stability and more grounding and more self-care and more effective reparenting, so that I'm not going the other direction and kind of letting this tear me down.
Yeah. I think it speaks to what you're talking about, really speaks to the need for community, and the fact that our instinct as human beings is to run from change, resist the change, and yet the change is being forced on us, and so more resistance comes up, and it's even getting more. There's even more of that, as we've been talking about, this desperation around COVID, and that makes us want to talk less about it because we're more and more desperate to get back to normality, but it will never be like it was, and so we're resistant to that.
Yeah.
All of these concepts are just like so huge, and I think that one of the silver linings, and I think that we should probably end it. Actually, let's end it somewhere in here, just so that we have something somewhere constructive to land. I think that, and you tell me what you think of this. I think that the advent of, because there's a lot of podcasts coming up, a lot of people there's been a shit ton of podcast microphones being sold, and people are, because they're at home and they're like, I'm going to talk about this. And I think that that's the right direction. And the fact that, yes, maybe I have to isolate more, so let's do more of what you and I are doing, and at least continue these conversations and honoring the fact that we have no idea what the frick is happening, where we're headed, for the first time in a long time, since really the Industrial Revolution, like this huge shift in our culture. And what does it look like? And it's scary and it's different. We don't know where we're going to land, if we ever do. All this uncertainty. And so what am I going to do with that? And how is that affecting the most important parts of my lives, which is my relationship with myself and the people that I love? Exactly. Like how is that affecting my ability to show up for myself? And the only way for me to know that is to get it out of my head and to invite my friend Michelle on, and to be and for me to say, this is what my crazy ass brain is telling me. What is your crazy ass brain telling me? And then I listen to your crazy ass brain and I'm like, oh God, well, at least I'm not that bad.
Yeah,
that's a joke. That's a joke.
One thing I'm good for is helping other people be like, oh, I'm doing fine.
Yeah.
Michelle's a shit show. I tried to sugarcoat it a little bit, so I didn't let all the crazy out today. But yeah, I mean, that doesn't mean I'm not going to go spend several hours playing solitaire while watching Grey's Anatomy after this.
Well, of course. Yeah, we do what we know.
Exactly. But yes, I totally agree. I do think, I say this all the time. Some of the clients I worked with will say I'm a broken record with how often I talk about how human beings are pack animals.
Yeah.
We are a species that binds together, works together, hunts together, gathers together. That's how we are, evolutionarily speaking, scientifically speaking. We're pack animals. And we're evolved to experience bonding when we go through hard things together, because that helps us keep ourselves safe.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're all going through this hard thing together,
anti-bonding.
Yes. Yeah. And being like separated from each other, the only, logical thing to do is to find ways to connect. And I think
Right.
that's been said over and over again throughout the pandemic, but it doesn't make it less important
Right.
to find how we connect and how we are still, if everything changes and we don't go back to normal, I don't think that means the qualities of our relationships have to change, or the ways that we connect and love each other has to change, or if it is going to change, it could maybe change for the better.
Yeah.
And that's, hopeful, but it will take maybe more effort than it used to.
Right. Well, all I know is that when I'm able to have these conversations, I always end up walking away feeling better.
Yes, me too.
And one of the reasons why I value our friendship is that our conversations, we literally have no bounds in terms of what we'll talk about. I just take the gloves off and I'll just upchuck all my crap at you, and you will hear me and you'll be like, oh yeah, well, I raised the ante with this. And it's just, I appreciate that so much. And I also really, really appreciate that you were willing to come on and have this discussion with me here. And
thank you for the invite.
Yeah, I'm very grateful for you.
This is basically just like when Perry and Michelle go for
a walk.
Talk for flowers. So
yeah. If you had a spy mic, it'd be this and even more insanity.
Oh yeah, there would be a bit more insanity, that's for sure.
I will I'll leave it here with you and do whatever this bow is.
Whatever this is.
Namaste.
Namaste.